A once-in-a-lifetime moment is approaching. Don't be mistaken into thinking that what's happening now is merely about tariffs. This is what Ray Dalio, the founder of the world's largest hedge fund, urgently stated in his post on April 9th. In recent days, the back-and-forth tariff battles between China and the United States have dealt a triple blow to the US stock, bond, and foreign exchange markets. With Trump's decision to suspend the tariff policies for countries other than China, his intention to target China has become all too evident. However, this situation inevitably makes one wonder, despite the risks to its own financial market, what exactly does the United States hope to gain from China? Perhaps we can find some hints from a widely circulated Mar-a-Lago agreement that emerged some time ago. This agreement mainly stems from a report by Stephen Moore, the chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisers. The report points out that if the United States wishes to continue being the dominant player in the global economy, first, it must impose large-scale tariffs to adjust the flow of trade, promote the return of manufacturing to the United States, increase fiscal revenue, and enhance the security of the US industrial sector. Second, it needs to establish a sovereign wealth fund that can replenish the national treasury. Finally, it should design a 100-year, non-tradable century bond. By converting short-term US Treasury bonds into ultra-long-term century bonds, it aims to force other countries to sell their US dollar assets and monetize the debt. In fact, Trump's most admired predecessor is Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, who wasn't overly renowned. In terms of finance, Andrew Jackson believed that the country should not rely on debt and advocated for a debt-free nation. In 1835, he successfully paid off all of the United States national debt, marking the only time in US history when the country had zero debt. At the same time, he opposed the central bank, closed the second bank of the United States, and weakened the financial oligarchy, which bears a striking resemblance to Trump's current ideology. However, times have changed. Due to factors such as the current hegemonic status of the US dollar, restructuring the manufacturing industry and reinventing the US debt system seem to be almost impossible tasks. If the United States wants to address its debt issues, there is only one viable path. Domestically, it requires the Federal Reserve's support in lowering interest rates to reduce the interest expenses of the national finance, and it needs to borrow new low-interest debts to pay off the old high-interest debts. Internationally, it needs to induce other countries around the world to sell their US dollar assets, thereby devaluing the US dollar, increasing the export advantage of US products, and achieving the goal of bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Let's first focus on the domestic aspect. Trump has been persistently calling for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates, but in return, he has only received Fed Chairman Jerome Powell's attitude of "let's wait and see." Whether the Federal Reserve should cut interest rates, a seemingly straightforward question, actually represents a significant divergence between the two factions in the United States. Many people think that the United States is reluctant to cut interest rates because of the fear of inflation. However, this view is rather superficial and even a bit naive. Inflation is just a set of data presented to the general public. When necessary, the data can even be manipulated, and its sole purpose is to provide legitimacy for policies. The real reason behind the decision on whether to cut interest rates can be understood in this way. The current US debt of $36 trillion is like a hot air balloon that has been inflated to its limit. Now, two groups of people are having a heated argument about how to prevent the balloon from bursting. The radical faction represented by Trump believes that the balloon is on the verge of bursting due to the debt interest and that drastic interest rate cuts are urgently needed, just like poking a hole in the balloon to release the air quickly. On the other hand, the conservative faction represented by the Federal Reserve believes that cutting interest rates too rapidly will lead to capital outflow from the United States, US Treasury bonds being sold off, and a blow to the credibility of the US dollar. It's like releasing the air too quickly, which might cause the balloon to lose control and plummet rapidly. Therefore, the conservative faction insists on controlling the pace, adopting the strategy of slowly opening the valve, while using slogans to reassure the passengers on the hot air balloon and continuously managing expectations. When the Federal Reserve, which controls the valve, refuses to release the air quickly, Trump can only resort to a steel needle to stab the balloon. This steel needle is launching a global trade war. This seemingly crazy act actually conceals a calculated strategy. By triggering market panic through the tariff war, it forces the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates to rescue the market. At the same time, it uses trade barriers to compel overseas US dollars to flow back. This way, you should be able to understand the thinking behind Trump's seemingly crazy behavior and the current stance of the Federal Reserve. Now, let's turn to the international situation. Historically, the United States once induced other countries to jointly devalue the US dollar, and this occurred exactly 40 years ago. In 1985, the 5 countries of the United States, France, Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom signed the Plaza Accord at the Plaza Hotel in New York. It's unclear what kind of influence led the other 4 countries to agree. After the agreement was signed, these 5 countries began to jointly sell a large amount of US dollars in the international foreign exchange market, causing the US dollar to depreciate significantly and continuously. This operation is somewhat similar to China's exchange rate reform in 1994, when the Chinese yuan was devalued by 50% at one time, making China's production materials and goods instantly cheaper. As a result, it enhanced the export competitiveness of Chinese products and attracted foreign investment, which was one of the important prerequisites for China to become an industrial powerhouse with a complete industrial chain. So, is it possible for the United States to repeat the same strategy today? To replicate the Plaza Accord of the past, the relevant countries would need to sell the US dollars in their hands once again. However, the problem is that most of the US dollar reserves of various countries are currently in the form of US Treasury bonds. In other words, if they want to sell US dollars, they must first sell US Treasury bonds. But if everyone starts selling US Treasury bonds, it will drive up the interest rate of US Treasury bonds, increase the US financing cost, and even lead to a US fiscal crisis. So, what's the solution? Thinking of the century bond mentioned in the Mar-a-Lago Agreement, it becomes easier to understand. The so-called century bond is a 100-year zero-coupon bond. This bond does not pay interest, cannot be traded, and is sold to creditors at a price lower than its face value. Only when the bond matures can the creditor receive the principal and earnings. This is equivalent to providing the United States with a century of free financing, effectively kicking the can down the road for a whole century. If a certain country needs US dollar cash during the holding period, it can mortgage the bond to the Federal Reserve to obtain a temporary loan. Then, the allies of the United States might be able to sell the US dollars obtained through this financing and, together with the United States, force the devaluation of the US dollar. In this way, the United States not only earns the interest but also achieves its goal, taking advantage of both sides. If other countries do not cooperate, at this moment, the United States will threaten them with exorbitant tariffs or the withdrawal of military protection to force them to comply. After all, in Trump's view, the allies and trading partners of the United States are all taking advantage of the country, and if he wants to set things right, he must apply extreme pressure. Therefore, the more outrageous the tariffs are and the more exaggerated the budget cuts for NATO are, the greater the room for negotiation will be. So, here comes the question: can Trump's scheme succeed? Let's state the conclusion first: it is bound to fail. Let's imagine that the United States is now like a global chain supermarket conducting business with US dollar vouchers printed by itself. If the United States wants everyone to use these vouchers, it needs to make two promises. First, these vouchers must maintain their value. To ensure the voucher's value, the products in the US supermarket must be abundant and of high quality, which means that the manufacturing system must be robust enough and trade must be kept smooth. However, just ensuring the voucher's value is not sufficient. The second thing the United States needs to ensure for the voucher's value is that there must be an adequate quantity of them. Since other countries around the world need to use these vouchers for settlement and also reserve some for emergencies, the US supermarket needs to continuously purchase goods by paying out vouchers and must have a larger purchase volume than the sales volume, maintaining a trade deficit. Thus, we can see that maintaining value and having an adequate quantity are inherently contradictory, which is the well-known Triffin dilemma in economics. But this is not the end. What we call globalization actually consists of two parts. The first part is the free trade proposed by the United States in 1947 after World War II. Free trade has brought long-term peace and prosperity to the world. This is easy to understand, just like the normal purchase and sale of goods in a supermarket. The second meaning of globalization, which is often overlooked but crucial, is the free flow of global capital that the United States, Europe, and Japan began to promote in the 1980s. In countries that implement the free flow of capital, investors can purchase bonds, stocks, real estate, and other assets of other countries. Especially after the United States initiated quantitative easing and a massive injection of money during the pandemic, the participants in the foreign exchange market have undergone a fundamental change. Nowadays, only 5% of foreign exchange transactions are related to trade flows, while the remaining 95% stem from the demand for the free flow of capital. This is equivalent to money moving much faster than goods, and money no longer follows the flow of goods. In other words, since the 1980s, the foreign exchange market has lost its function of promoting the rebalancing of the trade account. The United States has a relatively complete financial market and a long-running bull market in US stocks, which attracts a substantial amount of investment from around the world. This has led to a situation where the amount of US dollars purchased as global capital floods into US dollar assets far exceeds the amount of US dollars flowing out due to the US trade deficit. In other words, the value of the US dollar has long deviated from the true manufacturing strength of the United States and is significantly overvalued. The consequence of the overvaluation of the US dollar is that domestic US enterprises and consumers tend to choose purchasing over production. After all, if one can buy good products at a low cost, why bother to produce them? That's why there is such a saying: when the United States can print money or issue bonds to buy goods from all over the world, it is destined to have a continuous trade deficit. In essence, the free flow of capital has made the US manufacturing industry a victim of the US dollar. It has also made many people believe that they are losers in free trade. American workers and the manufacturing sector have lost their sense of security. However, in reality, to a large extent, all of this is caused by the free flow of capital. Yet Trump blames global imbalance on free trade. The expansion of US financial capital under the status of the US dollar as the world reserve currency is an inevitable outcome. For the United States, it means that US financial capital is highly regarded while industrial capital is marginalized. For the global economy, it is a problem of resource optimization. If the free flow of capital is allowed, but labor and other resources cannot flow freely due to national boundaries, it is as if different countries are essentially sharing the same currency and monetary policy. However, the situations of each country vary greatly, making resource misallocation and economic crises in other countries inevitable. Therefore, there is the famous quote from former US Treasury Secretary John Connally: "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." Even if Trump manages to cut interest rates as he wishes and issue century bonds to create conditions for the return of manufacturing, it will only address the symptoms rather than the root cause. As a representative of US industrial capital, Trump is challenging the currently unsolvable game between US industrial capital and financial capital. He is also taking on the Triffin dilemma, which has existed for more than 60 years. In simple terms, Trump can only choose between bringing manufacturing back to the United States and maintaining the US dollar's status as a reserve currency. If he insists on the return of US manufacturing, it will come at the expense of the credibility of US Treasury bonds and the hegemony of the US dollar. The Mar-a-Lago Agreement indeed corresponds to what is happening now. For example, regarding the issue of the US dollar exchange rate, on April 7th, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen had trade negotiations with Japan. The United States and Japan indicated that the two sides would discuss tariff policies and the exchange rate of the Japanese yen. Japan is the largest overseas creditor of US Treasury bonds. Next, China, the second largest creditor, will naturally not be left out. After all, rumors of negotiations with Beijing have been circulating since March. However, the nature of Sino-US relations has now undergone a huge change. The nature of Sino-US relations has shifted from complementary symbiosis to direct competition. In such a situation, it is no easy task to satisfy the interests of both sides. As we just mentioned, in the 1980s, US domestic industrial capital transformed into financial capital. Industrial capital is, in essence, like the hard-working laborers who have to wait for the crops to ripen or work long shifts in factories doing tough and dirty jobs. Financial capital, on the other hand, is like the boss sitting in an office, sipping coffee in the air conditioning and making money by investing in equities. With the expansion of financial capital, the US industry began to hollow out. Since then, US financial capital has been dominating the global market. With the acceleration of the globalization process, US industrial capital has been accelerating its outward transfer, first to Japan, then to the four Asian tigers, and later to China and Southeast Asia. The cooperation model between China and the United States in the first 40 years was like the relationship between laborers and bosses. Back then, China, like a young and vigorous entity looking for opportunities, happened to meet bosses who were willing to provide capital and technology to start businesses. One provided labor and the other provided capital, and they reached an agreement. For example, during China's reform and opening up in the 1980s, the Chinese mainland took advantage of the industrial upgrading opportunities of Japan and the four Asian tigers, made extensive use of foreign capital, and developed labor-intensive industries in the coastal areas. Then, through exports, it obtained foreign exchange and exchanged for the goods needed in the international market. In the 1990s, China's production capacity gradually increased. By the end of the 1990s, against the backdrop of domestic overcapacity and deflation, economic growth became increasingly dependent on overseas demand. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization (WTO), further increasing its dependence on foreign financial markets. China's exports grew rapidly, the scale of foreign investment continued to expand, international hot money kept flowing in, and foreign exchange reserves increased sharply. The massive foreign exchange assets could only be invested in the international financial market. Therefore, in the 21st century, China has further integrated into the globalization process dominated by US financial capital. That is to say, the expansion of China's industrial capital in the first 40 years coincided with the expansion of Western financial capital represented by the United States under the free flow of global capital. The industrial transfer from the United States created job opportunities for us. Although it was not beneficial to US employment, the profits it brought boosted the US capital market and greatly promoted the prosperity of Wall Street's capital market. While China's industrial capital and US financial capital shared the benefits of globalization, the United States became a financial and consumption powerhouse, and China became an industrial powerhouse. In 2007, Niall Ferguson, an American economic historian, proposed the concept of Chimerica, which refers to the community of interests jointly formed by the United States, the largest consumer country, and China, the largest producer country. This was also the honeymoon period of Sino-US cooperation. However, now both sides seem to want to become like each other. But that's another story. With the outbreak of the financial crisis in 2008, the situation changed dramatically. China invested $4 trillion to balance the inflation caused by the excessive issuance of US dollars. China's financial capital also developed rapidly under the stimulus of the $4 trillion investment. The excess production capacity meant that Chinese-made products had to continue to be exported overseas on a large scale. That is to say, from that time on, China gradually not only wanted to retain its industrial capital and employment opportunities, but also sought the profits brought by financial capital. After all, an employee who doesn't aspire to be a boss is not a motivated one. But this directly threatens the financial capital behind the US dollar, and it has gradually become the main contradiction between China and the United States. Therefore, in 2011, we saw Obama announce the Pivot to Asia plan. Behind Obama, who represents the Democratic Party, is the financial capital of Wall Street. In 2012, American economist Graham Allison proposed the concept of the Thucydides trap. Especially in recent years, China has been insisting on industrial upgrading, and its industrial capital has continued to expand. At the same time, China has proposed the goal of becoming a financial powerhouse and has been continuously strengthening its financial capital. China's financial capital has gradually replaced the position of foreign capital during the reform and opening up period in practical terms. For example, by using US dollars to exchange for the US dollar bonds of other countries and requiring them to repay RMB in the future, this strategy of promoting the internationalization of the RMB in a roundabout way has surprised the United States. As China's financial capital emerges on the world stage, US financial capital naturally feels uncomfortable. After being in a dominant position for a long time, no one is willing to voluntarily give up their privileged status and work on the factory floor doing manual labor. Trump is a representative of US industrial capital. With the current strength of US industrial capital, there is no doubt that it cannot directly compete with the deeply rooted US financial capital. Therefore, he has now taken a risky move by significantly escalating the trade war and using outrageous tariffs to artificially create turmoil. Because this strategy of seizing opportunities in chaos is much better than sitting idle by and waiting for the financial capital to end his political career. Objectively speaking, this strategy is directly competing with China, which is continuously upgrading its industry. This is also the core reason why we have been firmly standing up against it. We can see that whether it is due to the law of the Triffin dilemma or the constraints of the core interests within the United States and between China and the United States, it is certain that Trump's strategy is doomed to fail. As early as 1987, Trump wrote a book titled The Art of the Deal and boasted of being a master negotiator. Trump may just be a businessman, and in his eyes, everything is just a deal. Looking at the increasingly divided political and market economy in the United States, if he wants to make some progress, perhaps the greatest sincerity Trump can offer now is a certain island in China's southeastern region. Well, friends, that's all for today's topic. Thank you all for watching and for your likes and support.